All right, so get this. Today we're going to tackle this crazy question. What if Hitler actually won World War II?
A chilling thought for sure.
Yeah, it's a heavy one, but we're going to use these two YouTube videos, one from Ultra Argentina and another from their Comunidad Español.
Interesting.
Yeah, and then there's this article from the Spanish newspaper El País.
Oh, wow. Okay.
They've all got some really interesting points about this alternate timeline.
Yeah, exploring hypothetical scenarios like this is always a delicate balance. Acknowledging the disturbing premise, but also thinking about the potential ramifications.
For sure. So let's just jump right in with the big what ifs. What would need to happen differently? Like what major events for Germany to even have a chance of winning?
Okay, well, first, imagine Operation Barbarossa.
Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union
Exactly, and picture it actually succeeding.
instead of that brutal Eastern Front.
Right, the German army would have had to completely crush the Soviet defenses.
Kova collapse.
Yeah, and in reality, that never even came close to happening.
So no Eastern Front draining German resources. What about the rest of Europe?
Well, essentially, they would need domination. Germany solidifying its grip on Western Europe.
Okay, so they'd have to finally conquer Great Britain,
Right.
like what they tried with Operation Sea Lion.
Right. Hitler's planned invasion, that never happened.
There was just too much working against them.
Strong British defenses, the Luftwaffe's failure to get air superiority.
Yeah, it makes sense it never happened. So a very different picture of the war. Now, Ultra Argentina brought up this idea of a Nazi victory in Europe. What were your thoughts on their global implications?
The fascinating thing is a victorious Germany in Europe doesn't necessarily equal global domination.
Right, because they focus on how their reach would probably be pretty limited.
Exactly. They specifically mention how the Pacific theater would likely stay pretty much the same.
Japan still loses against the U.S.
Almost certainly. But okay, so maybe no worldwide Nazi empire. But a Nazi-controlled Europe still has to have major consequences, right? What about the Soviet Union? Would they just disappear? Not necessarily.
Really?
The video suggested there's a chance of a weakened Soviet state maybe holding on to Siberia
Okay.
and maybe even expanding their territory in Asia.
With U.S. support?
Right.
Wait, the U.S. backing the Soviets? But they have completely opposite ideologies.
Yeah, it highlights how complicated these hypotheticals are. The main threat becomes Nazi-controlled Europe.
I see. So the U.S. might see a weakened Soviet Union and even a victorious communist China as allies against Nazi Germany.
Exactly.
So no U.S.-Soviet Cold War. Instead, the remnants of the Allies, including the Soviets, against Nazi-dominated Europe.
Exactly. It's a very different world and potentially more volatile.
Okay, so this tense global situation. Let's look closer at Europe. Their Commandant Español paints a really bleak picture of life under Nazi rule. What were some details that stood out to you?
First, we're talking about a full-on totalitarian regime.
Okay, so what does that look like in Europe?
Well, imagine German as the official language, dissenting voices silenced,
Censorship everywhere.
and maybe even historical events like the Holocaust erased from public record.
That is terrifying, erasing history like that. I mean, what kind of society could even emerge from that?
Right. It really emphasizes the danger of unchecked ideology and how fragile truth is.
Absolutely. Now, their Commandant Español also mentioned something I found fascinating, that despite how evil it was, Nazi Germany might have actually pushed for faster technological development. What do you think about that?
It's complex, but I see the logic. Germany was a scientific powerhouse. Imagine them with the resources of a conquered Europe.
Their progress would be incredible, wouldn't it?
Especially in areas like rocketry and nuclear technology, potentially terrifying how fast their advancement could have been.
So in this alternate timeline, a technologically advanced but deeply oppressive Nazi state.
It's a chilling possibility. It raises ethical and philosophical questions.
It makes you wonder about the rest of Europe, too.
Right. No Marshall Plan, much slower and uncertain reconstruction. A pretty grim picture all around.
Definitely. Now, I want to talk about someone the El País article brought up, Wernher von Braun.
The rocket scientist?
Yeah, he worked for the Nazis and then later the U.S. space program. What did you think about his story in this context?
Well, it's a really interesting case study, right? The complexities of history. In a world where the Nazis win, the article suggested von Braun might have headed up a German space program.
So instead of the U.S. flag on the moon, it would be
A swastika.
a very unsettling image. But he ends up working for NASA in our timeline, helping put Americans on the moon. such different outcomes.
It really makes you think about how individuals can shape history,
Yeah.
for better or worse.
Yes.
Speaking of which, El País also talked about the chances of a Nazi victory in the long term. What were your takeaways from that?
Even if they won the war, the article suggests they might not have won the peace.
Okay.
The Nazi regime was inherently unstable. It had tons of resistance both inside and outside of Germany.
So they were almost destined to fall apart. Right. Think about all the economic problems they had, the power struggles within the party, plus widespread resistance in all those occupied territories. And then there's the question of what happens after Hitler dies.
Yeah, who takes over? A huge power vacuum.
Exactly. A recipe for implosion, even if they had won the war initially.
It really sounds like they would have collapsed eventually, even if they had won the war. But it still makes you wonder, right? I mean, what would the world be like if things had gone differently?
It sparks the imagination, doesn't it? I mean, the world as we know it would be fundamentally different.
Absolutely, like culture, technology, even the languages we speak.
Right. Everything.
I'm particularly interested in the tech side of things. Der Kommandant Español suggested that a Nazi victory, even though it sounds crazy, could have led to a more technologically advanced world. How is that even possible, given how oppressive the regime was?
Well, that's where things get really fascinating. Think about our timeline for a second. The Cold War between the US and the Soviet Union, it led to this massive arms race.
And that constant push to be ahead in terms of technology.
Exactly. And it resulted in all these groundbreaking advancements.
From rocketry and nuclear weapons all the way to computers.
Right. Everything. Now imagine a world where the Nazis win, and those same motivations for technological superiority are still in play, but it's not the US and Soviets driving it.
So instead of the US versus the Soviets, it's
What?
the world uniting against the Nazis, like even venturing into space just to counter their dominance.
Yeah, that's one possibility. Imagine the remaining Allied powers forced into this uneasy alliance with a weakened Soviet Union.
Okay, so they're all working together.
Right, and they're pouring resources into space exploration to try to counter Nazi Germany's tech advantage.
Wow, it sounds like something straight out of a sci-fi movie.
It's pretty wild, right? Humanity uniting to explore the stars because they have to resist this totalitarian regime back on Earth.
I love it. But it also brings up some really interesting questions. Well, would space exploration in this alternate timeline be all about military stuff, building weapons and defenses for a potential conflict in orbit?
It's definitely possible. Or would it be more about scientific discovery?
Maybe even trying to find refuge from a really messed up Earth.
It's hard to say for sure, but it really gets you thinking.
Would we even see a more collaborative approach, driven by necessity rather than national pride?
Yeah, I think that's a real possibility.
And maybe the advancements would happen even faster because there's this urgency to counter the Nazi threat.
It's definitely possible. In a way, a Nazi victory might have sped up humanity's journey into space. It's strange to think about, but it shows how even the darkest scenarios can have some unexpected consequences.
It's mind-blowing. So we've talked about this hypothetical Nazi victory, its impact on the bounds of power in the world, the horrors of living under Nazi rule, and even this weird idea of faster technological progress. What do you think are the most important takeaways from all of this?
For me, I think it comes down to understanding just how fragile history really is. We tend to think about the past as this fixed thing, unchangeable. But doing this exercise in alternate history really highlights how many crucial moments there were.
And how many seemingly small choices actually shaped the world we live in today?
Right, even the smallest changes could have led us down a completely different path.
It really is a humbling realization. Thinking about all those paths not taken, all the possibilities that never happened.
And in this case, I think we can be grateful that the outcome, as imperfect as our world might be, turned out better than the alternative.
Absolutely. I think it also reminds us how important it is to stand up against tyranny and oppression wherever they pop up.
Yeah.
And how vital the roles individuals play in shaping the course of history. Imagine if a few key decisions had gone the other way.
The world today could be totally unrecognizable.
It's mind-boggling. And it definitely underlines how important it is to learn from the past. If we don't understand how we got here, how easily things could have been different, we're probably going to repeat the mistakes that led to those awful conflicts in the first place.
Couldn't agree more. History isn't just memorizing names and dates. It's about understanding what drives human behavior, the choices we make, the consequences of those choices.
So how do we actually apply these lessons to our lives today? We're talking about this hypothetical situation, one that thankfully never happened. What does it mean for us in the 21st century?
I think the importance lies in the questions this all raises. Exploring alternate histories is kind of like stress testing our own reality. We push it to its limits to see where it might break down.
So it helps us identify the warning signs.
Exactly. The warning signs of tyranny, the dangers of getting complacent, how important it is to protect the freedoms we often take for granted.
It also makes you appreciate how interconnected the world really is, don't you think?
Mm.
I mean, we saw how a conflict in Europe could have huge ripple effects across the globe, impacting everything from global politics to technological advancements.
Definitely. It's a powerful reminder that we're not just acting on our own little stage. Our decisions have consequences. And those consequences can reach far beyond anything we can imagine.
It makes you think twice about the choices we make, both personally and as a society. We have this responsibility to learn from the past, to be aware in the present, and to try to build a future that's safer and more just for everyone.
Couldn't have said it better myself. It's a big challenge. But it's one worth taking on. You know, as we've been talking about this whole alternate timeline, there's one thing that keeps coming back to me, especially after our conversation about von Braun and those Nazi ambitions in space.
Yeah, you're right. We haven't really touched on space exploration that much. We talked about a possible Nazi space program, but how would the whole trajectory of space exploration be different if Hitler had dominated the world?
Well, think back to our timeline again. The space race was really fueled by that rivalry between the US and the Soviet Union during the Cold War. It became this huge competition for technological dominance and for bragging rights.
Oh, absolutely. It was about national pride just as much as scientific discovery. They wanted to prove their system was better.
Exactly. Now try to imagine a world where Nazi Germany is calling the shots. The reasons for going to space, the whole dynamic of it would probably be totally different.
So instead of US versus Soviets, it's what? The rest of the world teaming up against the Nazis, maybe even going to space just to fight back against them.
That's definitely a possibility. Imagine the Allied powers, even if they have to join forces with a weaker Soviet Union, putting everything they have into space exploration.
To try to stay ahead of the Nazis.
Right, to counter that technological advantage.
It's a wild thought, almost like a sci-fi movie. Humanity going to space to resist this oppressive regime back on Earth.
It's a pretty interesting idea, right?
It definitely is, and it raises all sorts of questions.
Like,
Well, would space exploration in this alternate world just be about the military? Building weapons and defenses for a potential war in space?
that's a possibility.
Or would there be more focus on actual scientific research? Maybe even using space to escape a really messed up Earth?
It's hard to say for certain. It really makes you think.
It does. Would we see more cooperation in space, driven by necessity rather than national pride?
I think that's definitely possible.
And maybe the advancements would happen even faster because of this urgency to fight the Nazi threat.
That could happen too. It might sound strange, but in some ways, a Nazi victory could have actually launched humanity into space sooner. It really shows how even the darkest situations can have unexpected outcomes.
It's pretty mind-blowing. Okay, so we've talked about this potential Nazi victory, what it would do to the world's power structure, the horrors of living under their rule, and even this strange idea of faster technological progress. As we wrap up this deep dive, what do you think are the most important things we've learned?
To me, it all comes back to understanding that history is incredibly fragile. We often think of it as this set-in-stone thing, something that can't be changed. But looking at this alternate history really shows us just how many key moments there were along the way.
And all those decisions, big and small, that shaped the world we live in today.
Right. Even the tiniest change could have taken us down a completely different path.
It's a very humbling thought. Makes you think about all those roads not taken, all those possibilities that never happened. And in this case, I think we can be grateful that things turned out, as imperfect as our world is, better than the alternative.
I absolutely agree. I think it also reminds us how crucial it is to resist oppression and tyranny wherever we see it, and how important individuals are in shaping the course of history. Just imagine if a few key choices had gone the other way.
It would be a completely different world. It's almost impossible to imagine.
Yeah.
It definitely emphasizes how much we need to learn from history. If we don't understand how we got here, how things could have easily been different, there's a good chance we'll just keep making the same mistakes that led to those horrible conflicts.
I couldn't agree more. History is more than memorizing dates and names. It's
Yeah.
about understanding what drives people, the decisions they make, and the impact those decisions have.
Right, so how do we apply those lessons to our own lives? I mean, we've been talking about this made-up scenario, thankfully one that never happened. What does all this mean for us in the 21st century?
I think the real value is in the questions it raises. When we explore these what-if histories, it's almost like we're putting our own reality to the test, pushing it to its limits to see where it might break.
So it helps us see the warning signs.
Exactly. Warning signs of things like tyranny, the dangers of becoming too comfortable, how important it is to protect the freedoms we often take for granted.
It also really makes you think about how interconnected everything in the world is. I mean, we saw how a conflict in Europe could have had these ripple effects across the whole planet, changing everything from global politics to technology.
Absolutely. It really highlights how we're not just isolated players on the world stage. What we do has consequences, and those consequences can spread much further than we can even grasp.
Makes you think twice about the choices you make, both as an individual and as part of society. We have a duty to learn from history, to stay aware of what's going on right now, and to try to create a better future, one that's more just and safer for everyone.
That's a great way to put it. It's a tough job, but it's worth doing.
Absolutely. To all our listeners out there, thanks for coming along with us on this exploration of a world that thankfully never was. We encourage you to keep asking those what-if questions, to dig deeper into history, and to never stop learning. Because by wrestling with these complex questions, by facing the dark parts of the past, we can find our way to a better future.
I agree. Until next time, keep those minds curious, keep exploring, and keep diving deep.